What would you do if innocent lives were seconds from disaster? Would you risk everything to save them? In this story, a teacher finds a golden retriever and her pups tied to train tracks, just as the train approaches. His heroic actions will leave you speechless. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Let's dive in. The morning started quietly in the sprawling plains of rural Kansas, the kind of peaceful day Ethan Carter appreciated. As a history teacher in a small town, he often found solace in the simplicity of his environment. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow across the fields, and the faint hum of the distant train could be heard in the background. Ethan had taken his usual morning jog, his well-worn sneakers crunching against the gravel road leading past the tracks. It was during this routine run that something unusual caught his eye. Up ahead, near the railroad tracks, a shape stood out against the stillness of the scene. Ethan squinted against the early morning light, his breath clouding in the cool air. At first, he thought it was debris blown onto the tracks, but as he approached, his heart sank. A golden retriever lay on its side, visibly shaking, with 3 tiny pups huddled close to her. Their cries were faint but desperate, carried on the crisp wind. But what truly horrified Ethan was the realization that the mother dog and her pups were bound tightly to the tracks with coarse rope. Panic surged through him as the low rumble of an approaching train became audible in the distance. Who would do this? Ethan muttered to himself, his voice trembling as he crouched near the dogs. The mother's eyes locked with his, wide with terror, but filled with a strange hope that Ethan could not ignore. Her pups wriggled, trying in vain to free themselves, their tiny bodies trapped by the cruel knots. Ethan fumbled with his phone, dialing 911. His voice was steady but urgent. "This is Ethan Carter. I'm at the tracks near Pine Grove and Willow. Someone tied a dog and her puppies to the rails, and there's a train coming. I need help now." The dispatcher's voice was calm but firm. "We're sending someone, sir. Do you know how soon the train will arrive?" Ethan turned his head, his pulse quickening at the growing vibration beneath his feet. "Not long. I'll do what I can." He ended the call and dropped his phone into his pocket, his mind racing. The train's whistle sounded, loud and haunting, cutting through the stillness like a warning. There wasn't enough time to wait for help. Ethan bent down and began working on the ropes with shaking hands, his fingers numb in the cold. Hey, it's okay," Ethan whispered, his voice softening as he addressed the trembling golden retriever. "I've got you. I won't let anything happen to you." The knots were tight, biting into his fingers as he struggled to loosen them. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill, and the train's horn blared again, closer now. He glanced up, his stomach flipping as he saw the train's lights appear around the bend, a hulking steel mass barreling toward them. Come on. Ethan growled under his breath, yanking at the last of the bindings. He freed the mother first, and she immediately nudged her pups with her nose, as if encouraging them to hold on. With seconds to spare, Ethan gathered the squirming puppies in his arms and motioned for the mother to follow. She stumbled at first, her legs wobbly from being restrained, but managed to keep pace. The ground shook violently as Ethan darted off the tracks, his breath coming in gasps. The train roared past, its sheer power rattling him to his core. The rush of wind stung his face, but all he could think about was the warmth of the tiny pups nestled against his chest and the mother dog pressing into his side. Once they were safely on the grassy embankment, Ethan sank to his knees, trembling. The mother dog licked his face, a silent thanks that brought tears to his eyes. "You're safe now," Ethan murmured, stroking her head. "I've got you." Ethan sat on the embankment, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breathing. The puppies wriggled in his arms, their tiny whimpers piercing through the residual roar of the train that had just thundered past. The mother golden retriever, now freed, pressed her wet nose against Ethan's hand as though thanking him, her tail wagging faintly despite her clear exhaustion. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he fumbled to answer. It was the 911 dispatcher. "Mr. Carter, are you okay? Officers and animal control are on their way. They're safe," Ethan managed, his voice shaky. "The train just passed. I got them off in time." The dispatcher let out a relieved sigh. "Good. Stay where you are. Help is coming." Ethan hung up and looked down at the pups in his lap. They were no more than a few weeks old, their eyes barely open. Each one bore the signs of neglect, ribs visible under patchy fur, and dirt caked onto their tiny paws. The mother wasn't in much better shape. Her once golden coat was matted and dull, and her thin frame suggested she hadn't eaten well in weeks. "Who could do this to you?" Ethan murmured, stroking the mother's head. She leaned into his touch, her body trembling but her eyes steady, filled with a strange mixture of fear and trust. Minutes later, the sound of tires crunching on gravel announced the arrival of the police. Officer Rachel Miller, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a kind demeanor, stepped out of her cruiser. She approached cautiously, her gaze shifting from Ethan to the dogs. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, her voice calm but concerned. "Yeah," Ethan replied, standing slowly. "I'm fine. But these dogs, someone tied them to the tracks. It was deliberate." Rachel's expression hardened. She crouched beside the mother dog, who flinched but didn't pull away. "Poor girl," she murmured, examining the rope marks on the dog's neck and paws. This wasn't just neglect. This was cruelty. Animal control arrived shortly after, a young man named Kyle stepping out of the van with a carrying crate. "We'll take them to the shelter," he said, kneeling to inspect the pups. "They'll get medical care and food." Ethan hesitated. He looked down at the mother dog, who was now watching him intently, her eyes wide with worry. The idea of handing her and the pups over to strangers felt wrong. She had trusted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she needed him. "Wait," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I'll take them home, at least for now. I can't let them go to a shelter, not after this." Kyle looked skeptical. "Sir, they'll be in good hands. We've got veterinarians." "I'm not questioning that," Ethan interrupted, his tone resolute. "But they've been through enough today. They need a quiet place, somewhere they can feel safe. I'll take care of them." Rachel glanced at Kyle, then back at Ethan. "It's unorthodox, but if you're willing to take responsibility, I don't see why not. We'll need your contact information and a promise to bring them in for checkups." Of course, Ethan agreed. By the time the officers left, the dogs were nestled in Ethan's old pickup truck. The mother lay on the back seat, her head resting on her paws as her pups slept in a makeshift bed of blankets. Ethan drove slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. When he pulled into his driveway, his daughter Sarah was standing on the porch, her arms crossed and her expression unimpressed. At 16, Sarah was every bit the teenager, sarcastic, distant, and perpetually glued to her phone. "What is this?" she asked as Ethan climbed out of the truck. Ethan opened the door and gestured to the dogs. "Found them tied to the train tracks this morning. They're staying here for now." Sarah's eyebrows shot up. "You're kidding, right? We don't even have a dog." "We do now," Ethan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "They've been through hell. The least we can do is give them a safe place." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Great. More mouths to feed." Ethan sighed. "Sarah, this isn't up for debate. Grab some towels and help me get them inside." Reluctantly, Sarah obeyed, grumbling under her breath as she followed Ethan into the house. Despite her resistance, her gaze lingered on the tiny pups, a flicker of curiosity breaking through her usual indifference. That night, as the dogs settled into their new surroundings, Ethan couldn't shake the memory of their terrified faces on the tracks. He vowed silently to give them the care and safety they deserved, and perhaps to mend something broken within his own family along the way. As the house grew quiet that evening, Ethan found himself sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of lukewarm coffee. The rescued golden retriever, who Sarah had hesitantly agreed to name Luna, lay curled at his feet, her pups snuggled against her in a pile of fur and tiny snores. The soft sounds of their breathing filled the silence, but Ethan's thoughts were elsewhere, drifting to memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was one of the few he still kept of Emily. In the picture, she was sitting on the porch swing of their old house, holding a much younger Sarah on her lap. Her laugh was frozen in time, her eyes bright and full of life. It was hard to believe it had been 3 years since cancer had taken her. Ethan rubbed his temples, the familiar ache of loss settling in. Emily had been the glue of their family, the one who kept their small world spinning. After her death, it felt like everything had unraveled. Sarah, once a bubbly and affectionate child, had retreated into a shell of teenage apathy, and Ethan had thrown himself into his work, using his teaching job as an escape. "Dad," Sarah's voice startled him out of his thoughts. He quickly slid the photograph back into his pocket as she appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. "Yeah?" Ethan asked, looking up. Sarah hesitated, her gaze darting to Luna and the pups before settling on her father. "You're really keeping them?" "For now," Ethan said, his tone gentle but firm. "They need us, Sarah. Someone tied them to those tracks like they were garbage. They don't have anyone else." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her usual sarcasm replaced with something softer. "But what if we can't take care of them? What if they get sick or something?" Ethan gave her a small smile. "We'll figure it out. Together." For a moment, Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but then her shoulders slumped. "Okay," she mumbled. "Good night, Dad." "Good night, sweetheart," Ethan replied, watching her retreat upstairs. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, Ethan woke early to the sound of tiny paws skittering across the hardwood floor. He found Luna and her pups exploring the living room, their tails wagging as they stumbled over themselves. It was a scene that would have made Emily laugh, a bittersweet thought that made Ethan's chest tighten. "Hey, no chewing on the couch," he muttered, gently scooping up one of the pups before it could sink its teeth into the fabric. Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs, her hair a mess and her expression groggy. She paused when she saw the scene below, a flicker of something resembling amusement crossing her face. "You're going to need a miracle to keep them from destroying the house," she said, leaning against the railing. Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, well, I've dealt with worse. Remember when you decided to paint the kitchen walls with pudding?" Sarah rolled her eyes, but couldn't hide the faint smile tugging at her lips. "I was 5, and it took me 3 hours to clean it up," Ethan countered, setting the pup back down. The light-hearted moment was short-lived as the doorbell rang, breaking the spell. Ethan opened the door to find Rachel Miller, the officer who had responded to the scene the previous day. She held a file folder and wore a serious expression. "Morning, Ethan," Rachel said. "Mind if I come in?" Ethan stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. "Sure. What's this about?" Rachel glanced at Luna, who had perked up at the sight of a new person. "I've been looking into what happened yesterday. There's something you should know." Ethan's stomach tightened as Rachel laid the folder on the table. Inside were photographs, grainy but clear enough to recognize. They showed a group of teenagers, their faces partially obscured, standing near the tracks. One of them was holding a rope, and another appeared to be laughing. "I'm sorry to bring this to your doorstep," Rachel said, her voice low, "but I recognize some of these kids. They're from the high school." "Your high school?" Ethan's jaw tightened as he studied the photos. His gaze landed on one face in particular, half hidden under a hoodie but unmistakable. Sarah's friend, Jake. He leaned back in his chair, a heavy silence settling over the room. "Does Sarah know?" Rachel hesitated. "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. This kind of thing, it's serious. And if your daughter is connected, she's not," Ethan said quickly, though the doubt in his voice betrayed him. "She wouldn't." Rachel gave him a pointed look. "I hope you're right. But we need to figure this out, Ethan. For everyone's sake." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind racing. He glanced at Luna and her pups, then back to Rachel. "I'll talk to her." Later that evening, Ethan stood outside Sarah's bedroom door, his heart heavy with apprehension. He knew the conversation ahead wouldn't be easy, but the photographs Rachel had shown him left no room for delay. Knocking softly, he heard a muffled, "Come in." Sarah was sprawled on her bed, earbuds in, scrolling through her phone. When she noticed Ethan, she pulled one earbud out and sighed. "What now?" Ethan stepped inside and closed the door behind him, holding the folder Rachel had left. "We need to talk." "Great," Sarah muttered, sitting up and crossing her arms. "What's it about this time? The dogs? School?" My attitude? It's about the dogs, Ethan said carefully, taking a seat on the edge of her desk chair. He opened the folder and slid one of the photographs toward her. Recognize anyone? Sarah's eyes widened as she stared at the image. She quickly looked away, but her reaction spoke volumes. No, she said flatly, her voice laced with defiance. Sarah, Ethan pressed, his tone firm but calm. Don't lie to me. I know that's Jake. Sarah's jaw tightened, and she hugged her knees to her chest. So what if it is? It doesn't mean anything. Ethan leaned forward, his voice softening. It means a lot, Sarah. Those dogs were tied to the tracks. Someone wanted them to die, and you hang out with the people who did it. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. I didn't know they were gonna do that, she snapped. I thought it was a stupid prank or something. I didn't think they'd actually. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Ethan's heart ached as he watched his daughter struggle with guilt and fear. He moved to sit beside her on the bed. Sarah, listen to me. This isn't just about what they did. It's about what kind of person you want to be. You can't just stand by when something like this happens. You have to take responsibility. Sarah sniffled and looked up at him, her eyes red. What am I supposed to do? They're my friends. If I say anything, they'll hate me. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Sometimes doing the right thing means making hard choices, but you don't have to do it alone. We'll figure this out together. The next morning, Ethan woke early to the sound of soft barking. Luna was in the living room with her pups, who were tumbling over one another in a chaotic game of tag. Sarah was sitting cross-legged on the floor, watching them with a faint smile. Ethan leaned against the doorway, a mug of coffee in hand. They seem happy, he remarked. Sarah glanced up, startled. Yeah, I guess. She hesitated, then added, They're cute. The little one's my favorite. Ethan smiled. You can name him if you want. Sarah bit her lip, thinking for a moment. How about Chance? Chance, Ethan repeated, nodding. I like it. Fits. As the day went on, Sarah surprised Ethan by taking an active role in caring for the dogs. She fed them, cleaned their bedding, and even took Chance outside to explore the yard. It was the first time in months that Ethan had seen her so engaged, and he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Sarah broke the silence. I talked to Jake, she said, her voice quiet. Ethan set down his fork, meeting her gaze. What did he say? He admitted it, Sarah said, her hands trembling slightly. He said it was Ryan's idea, but they all went along with it. I told him it was messed up, and he just laughed. Like it wasn't a big deal. Ethan's jaw tightened. And what about you? Are you going to let them get away with it? Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. No, I don't want to, but I don't know what to do. Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. We'll go to the principal tomorrow. Rachel will help us handle the rest. Sarah nodded, her eyes brimming with determination. For the first time in a long while, Ethan saw a spark of the strong, compassionate girl Emily had raised. As the days passed, the dogs became a constant presence in their lives. Luna, ever loyal, followed Ethan from room to room, while Sarah bonded deeply with Chance. The puppy's playful antics brought laughter to the house, and for the first time in years, it felt like a home again. Though the road ahead was uncertain, Ethan knew one thing for sure. They were stronger together. And with Luna and her pups by their side, maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to being a family. The following day, Ethan and Sarah arrived at the high school early. Sarah walked a step behind her father, her head bowed and her hands stuffed into her hoodie pocket. Ethan glanced back at her, his heart heavy with both pride and concern. This wasn't easy for her, and he knew it. Facing peers and admitting involvement, even indirectly, required courage most adults would struggle to summon. Inside, Principal Janet Moore waited in her office. A no-nonsense woman in her 50s, Janet was known for her firm but fair approach. She looked up as Ethan knocked on the open door and motioned for them to come in. Mr. Carter, Sarah, please sit. Janet's tone was professional, but there was a softness in her eyes as she addressed Sarah. I understand you have something important to discuss. Sarah swallowed hard. her eyes darting toward Ethan for reassurance. He gave her a small nod. "Go ahead, Sarah. You're doing the right thing." Taking a deep breath, Sarah began. "It's about the dogs. The ones tied to the tracks." Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. "It was Jake, Ryan, and Mia. I didn't know they were going to actually do it. I thought it was just a joke, but I was there when they planned it." Janet's expression hardened. "Sarah, this is serious. Are you saying you witnessed them discussing tying the dogs to the tracks?" Sarah nodded, her eyes welling up. "Yes, but I didn't think they'd really do it." Janet leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. "Thank you for being honest, Sarah. It takes a lot of courage to come forward. We'll need to speak with the other students involved and their parents. This will have consequences, but you've done the right thing by telling the truth." Ethan reached out and squeezed Sarah's shoulder. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. Later that afternoon, Rachel Miller arrived at the high school to meet with Janet. Ethan and Sarah sat quietly in the corner of the office while Rachel reviewed the details. "We have enough to proceed," Rachel said, closing her notebook. "This isn't just about the dogs. This is animal cruelty, and there are legal ramifications." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Will they get arrested?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel sighed. "That depends. Since they're minors, it's likely they'll face community service, mandatory counseling, and possibly probation. The goal isn't to punish them, but to make sure they understand the seriousness of what they've done." Ethan frowned. "And what about Sarah? She was there, but she didn't take part." Rachel offered a small smile. "Sarah did the hardest thing. She spoke up. That goes a long way. I'll make sure her cooperation is taken into account." That evening, Ethan and Sarah returned home, both emotionally drained. Luna greeted them at the door, wagging her tail and nosing Sarah's hand as if sensing her need for comfort. Sarah knelt down, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck. "You're a good girl, Luna," she whispered. Ethan watched the interaction, a mixture of relief and hope swelling in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like they were moving forward, not just as individuals, but as a family. The following week, the fallout from Sarah's confession unfolded. Jake, Ryan, and Mia were called into meetings with their parents and the school administrators. The teens initially denied their involvement, but when presented with Sarah's testimony and the photographs Rachel had gathered, the truth came out. During one tense meeting, Jake's father, a hot-tempered man with a booming voice, confronted Ethan in the school parking lot. "Your kid had no business dragging my son into this," he barked, his face red with anger. Ethan stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. "Your son tied defenseless animals to a train track. My daughter didn't drag him into anything. He made his own choices." Jake's father took a step closer, but Rachel, who had accompanied Ethan to the school, intervened. "That's enough," she said, stepping between the two men. "This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about accountability." Jake's father muttered something under his breath and stormed off, leaving Ethan shaken but resolute. As the weeks passed, Jake, Ryan, and Mia began their court-mandated community service at a local animal shelter. Ethan, with Rachel's support, arranged for the teens to work directly with rescue dogs, cleaning kennels, walking dogs, and assisting with adoptions. At first, their attitudes were sullen and resentful, but over time, something began to shift. Jake, who had initially mocked the dogs, was seen one afternoon quietly stroking the fur of a nervous Labrador mix. Ryan, known for his arrogance, started asking questions about dog behavior and training. Even Mia, usually glued to her phone, began taking pride in helping the dogs find homes. One evening, as Ethan and Sarah sat on the porch watching Luna play with her pups, Sarah turned to her father. "Do you think they'll change?" Ethan took a sip of his coffee, considering the question. "I think they already are. Sometimes it takes seeing the impact of your actions to really understand them." Sarah nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I guess. I hope they do." Ethan placed an arm around her shoulders. "You're part of the reason they even have a chance to change, Sarah. You stood up and did what was right. That's more than most people would do." Sarah leaned into him, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting. "Thanks, Dad. Anytime, kiddo," Ethan said. smiling as Luna trotted over to join them, her pups bounding happily behind her. The atmosphere in the Carter household grew heavier as the reality of Sarah's involvement began to sink in. While her confession had been brave, it was clear to Ethan that the emotional toll was far from over. He could see it in the way Sarah avoided her friends' messages and in the way she lingered with Luna and her pups, as if seeking solace in their presence. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Ethan decided it was time for the next step. The family dynamic was shifting, and he wanted Sarah to fully understand the weight of her actions and the opportunity for redemption. "Sarah," Ethan began, his tone steady but firm, "we need to talk about what comes next." Sarah looked up from her plate, her shoulders tensing. "I already told the truth, Dad. What else is there?" Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Telling the truth was the first step, but it's not the only one. I want you to help take care of Luna and the pups. All of them. That includes feeding them, cleaning up after them, and making sure they're healthy." Sarah blinked, clearly caught off guard. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Ethan said, his expression unwavering. "These dogs didn't ask to be hurt. They didn't ask to be tied to those tracks. And while you didn't tie the knots yourself, you were there when it was planned. Taking care of them is how you'll show you understand the damage that was done." Sarah hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Luna, who was lying on a blanket near the fireplace. The pups were curled up against her, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. "What if I mess up?" Sarah asked quietly. Ethan softened, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "You won't. And even if you do, that's part of learning. I'll be here to help you. But this is your responsibility now, Sarah. You need to own it." The next morning, Sarah reluctantly began her new routine. Ethan handed her a list of tasks: preparing food for the dogs, cleaning their bedding, and checking their paws for any signs of injury. At first, Sarah worked slowly, her frustration evident. "Why do I have to do all of this?" she grumbled as she scooped kibble into a bowl. Ethan, who was cleaning the kitchen, glanced over his shoulder. "Because it matters. You're not just taking care of them, you're helping them heal. And maybe, in the process, you'll learn something about yourself." Sarah rolled her eyes but didn't argue further. Over the next few days, something remarkable began to happen. Sarah, initially resistant, started to find moments of connection with the dogs. One afternoon, as she sat in the backyard, Chance, her favorite pup, stumbled over to her with a wagging tail and a tiny ball in his mouth. "Is that for me?" Sarah asked, her tone lighter than it had been in weeks. Chance dropped the ball at her feet, his tail wagging furiously. Sarah laughed, a genuine sound Ethan hadn't heard in months. She picked up the ball and tossed it gently, watching as Chance bounded after it with clumsy enthusiasm. Ethan observed from the porch, a smile tugging at his lips. "Looks like someone's got a new best friend," he said. Sarah turned to him, her cheeks flushed from the cool air. "He's just a baby," she said, her voice soft. "He doesn't even know how to fetch right." "Maybe he'll learn," Ethan replied. "With your help." As Sarah's bond with the dogs grew, so did her understanding of the consequences of her actions. She began to talk more openly about the incident at the tracks, often pausing to reflect on how easily she could have stopped it if she'd spoken up earlier. One evening, as she and Ethan cleaned the pups' bedding, Sarah broke the silence. "I feel like I let them down," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan paused, turning to look at her. "Who?" "The dogs. And maybe myself," Sarah said, her eyes downcast. "I knew it was wrong. I should have said something, but I didn't." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We all make mistakes, Sarah. What matters is what we do afterward. And look at you. You're doing the work. You're making it right." Sarah nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I guess. It just feels like it'll never be enough." "It will be," Ethan said firmly. "Every time you show them kindness, every time you take care of them, you're proving that you've changed. And that's what matters." By the end of the week, Sarah's demeanor had shifted. She was more engaged, more present, and even began to take pride in her care for the dogs. Her friends, however, were less understanding. Jake, Ryan, and Mia had begun avoiding her at school. their cold shoulders a stark reminder of the cost of doing the right thing. "They hate me," Sarah said one evening as she sat with Ethan on the porch, Chance asleep on her lap. "They don't hate you," Ethan replied. "They're scared. They know you've done what they couldn't, taken responsibility." Sarah looked out at the horizon, her expression thoughtful. "I guess that's their problem, not mine." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's my girl." In the following weeks, Sarah's life took on a new rhythm centered around Luna and her puppies. Each morning began with feeding the dogs, checking their water bowls, and taking them outside for exercise. Ethan noticed a change in her. She moved with purpose, her usual teenage aloofness replaced with quiet determination. But it wasn't just Sarah who was transforming. The community service assignments for Jake, Ryan, and Mia had also begun. They were assigned to the town's small animal shelter, a modest building tucked behind the local fire station. The shelter's director, Mrs. Catherine Brooks, was a stern but compassionate woman in her 60s who had little tolerance for laziness or excuses. "Welcome to reality," Mrs. Brooks said on their first day, handing each teenager a pair of rubber gloves and a mop. "Those kennels don't clean themselves. And these dogs didn't end up here because they had happy lives. You're here to make things better, not worse." At first, the teenagers approached their work with reluctance. Jake, always the loudest in their group, complained incessantly as he scrubbed cages. Ryan avoided eye contact with the shelter staff, and Mia spent every spare moment glued to her phone. But as the days passed, their attitudes began to shift. One morning, while Jake was tasked with walking an anxious Labrador named Charlie, the dog bolted as soon as they stepped outside. Charlie's leash slipped from Jake's grasp, and panic set in as the dog darted into the street. "Charlie, no!" Jake shouted, his voice cracking with fear. To his relief, Charlie stopped short, distracted by a patch of grass. Jake ran over, grabbing the leash and dropping to his knees. "I'm sorry, buddy," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to scare you." Charlie looked at Jake, his tail wagging tentatively. In that moment, something clicked for Jake. The dog wasn't just an animal. It was a living, breathing creature that depended on him. From that day forward, Jake's complaints stopped, and he began taking his responsibilities seriously. Meanwhile, Ryan found himself drawn to a scrappy terrier mix named Max who refused to let anyone near him. Max growled and barked whenever someone approached his kennel, his fear evident in his bared teeth and trembling body. "Why does he act like that?" Ryan asked Mrs. Brooks one afternoon. "He's been through a lot," she replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "He was abandoned in the woods and barely survived. It's going to take time for him to trust anyone again." Ryan hesitated before pulling a chair up to Max's kennel. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, keeping his distance. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to sit here for a while." Day after day, Ryan returned to Max's kennel, sitting quietly and letting the dog grow used to his presence. Eventually, Max began to relax, and one afternoon, he cautiously approached Ryan, sniffing his outstretched hand. Ryan's face lit up with a smile. "There you go, Max. I told you I wouldn't hurt you." Mia's transformation was subtler, but no less significant. Initially dismissive of the shelter's work, she was assigned to help with adoption events. At one event, a family came in looking for a dog to adopt. Their youngest daughter, a shy girl named Lily, was immediately drawn to a gentle collie named Daisy. "Are you sure she's good with kids?" the mother asked Mia, skepticism in her tone. Mia knelt beside Daisy, stroking her fur. "She's amazing with kids," she said, her voice surprisingly genuine. "She's been through a lot, but she's so sweet. I think she'd be perfect for your family." Watching Lily hug Daisy with pure joy, Mia felt a warmth she hadn't expected. For the first time, she saw the impact her actions could have, and it made her want to do better. Back at home, Sarah continued her work with Luna and the puppies. One evening, Ethan found her in the backyard, sitting with Chance on her lap and Luna resting her head on Sarah's knee. "Hey," he said, stepping outside with 2 mugs of hot cocoa. "Thought you could use a break." Sarah smiled and took the mug he offered, sipping it as she watched the puppies tumble over each other in the grass. "You know," she said after a moment, "I think I get it now." "Get what?" Ethan asked, sitting beside her. Why you wanted me to do this, Sarah replied. Taking care of them, it's not just about them. It's about me too. About being better. Ethan placed an arm around her shoulders, pride swelling in his chest. You're already better, Sarah, and I couldn't be prouder of you. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in a warm golden glow, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The journey wasn't over, not for Sarah, the teens, or the dogs, but for the first time, it felt like they were all headed in the right direction. The days turned into weeks, and slowly but surely, the Carter household began to transform. The once muted atmosphere, heavy with the weight of unspoken grief and tension, grew warmer. The laughter of a teenager, the playful yips of puppies, and the rhythmic wagging of Luna's tail filled the house with life once more. One Friday evening, Ethan decided it was time to have a real family dinner. Not the kind where Sarah ate silently with her headphones in or where Ethan retreated behind his plate, lost in thought. This time, it would be different. Sarah, can you help me with the salad? Ethan called from the kitchen. Sarah appeared in the doorway, a skeptical look on her face. Since when do you care about salads? Ethan chuckled, tossing a cucumber into the air and catching it with flair. Since now. Come on. Humor your old man. With a dramatic sigh, Sarah joined him at the counter. As they worked side by side, Ethan chopping vegetables with questionable precision and Sarah correcting his every move. The room filled with an unexpected ease. So, Ethan ventured. How was school today? Sarah shrugged. Fine, I guess. Jake and the others don't really talk to me anymore. Ethan paused, his knife hovering above a carrot. And how do you feel about that? Sarah thought for a moment, her hands busy tearing lettuce. Honestly, it sucks, but I don't want to be like them. I'm glad I did the right thing, even if it's hard. Ethan smiled, his chest swelling with pride. That's a pretty mature perspective. I know it's not easy, but you're doing something a lot of people wouldn't have the courage to do. Sarah's lips quirked into a small smile. Thanks, Dad. As they sat down to eat, Luna lay at Ethan's feet, her pups sprawled across the living room floor. The aroma of Ethan's homemade spaghetti filled the air, and for the first time in years, it felt like they were truly a family again. Remember that trip to Yellowstone? Ethan asked, twirling spaghetti onto his fork. Sarah's face lit up. The one where Mom made us stop at every single scenic overlook? That's the one, Ethan said, laughing. She took so many pictures that the camera battery died halfway through the trip, and then she made us buy one of those disposable cameras from the gift shop, Sarah added, giggling. Ethan nodded, his smile tinged with nostalgia. She always had a way of making even the simplest things feel like an adventure. A comfortable silence settled over the table as they both let the memory wash over them. It wasn't painful, as it had been in the past. It was bittersweet, but it felt good to remember her like this, alive, vibrant, and full of love. The next day, Ethan suggested taking Luna and the puppies to the park for some fresh air. Sarah agreed, surprising him by suggesting they pack a picnic. As they strolled through the park, Luna trotted happily beside them, her leash held loosely in Sarah's hand. The puppies tumbled over one another in the grass, drawing smiles and laughter from passers-by. Do you think Chance will get adopted? Sarah asked as they watched the pups play. Ethan glanced at her, noting the slight tension in her voice. Maybe, but if he doesn't, that's okay too. He's got a pretty good home right here. Sarah's eyes softened as she knelt to scoop Chance into her arms. I don't think I want him to go anywhere, she admitted. Ethan smiled. Then maybe he's already found his forever home. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan and Sarah sat on the porch, sipping hot chocolate. The puppies were asleep inside, and Luna lay at Sarah's feet, her head resting on her paws. Do you think Mom would have liked Luna? Sarah asked suddenly, her voice quiet. Ethan took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the fading light. She would have loved her. Your mom had the biggest heart. She would have been out here spoiling Luna with treats and cuddles every day. Sarah smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. I miss her. I do too, Ethan said softly. But you know what? She'd be so proud of you, Sarah. Proud of how you've grown, of the choices you've made. she'd see the incredible person you're becoming. Sarah leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. Thanks, Dad. Ethan wrapped an arm around her, his heart full. Anytime, kiddo. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. They were healing, slowly, imperfectly, but together. While the Carters worked on rebuilding their bond, a quieter transformation was unfolding at the local animal shelter. Jake, Ryan, and Mia had entered their community service with defiance and reluctance, but weeks of working with the shelter animals were reshaping their perspectives and their lives. One afternoon, Jake was tasked with walking Daisy, an energetic hound mix with a stubborn streak. It was his least favorite job. Daisy pulled on the leash and ignored his commands, seemingly more interested in sniffing every blade of grass than actually walking. Frustrated, Jake groaned and muttered, "You're impossible. You know that?" Mrs. Brooks, the shelter director, observed him from the doorway. "You're not going to get anywhere with her like that," she called out. Jake turned, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What am I supposed to do? She doesn't listen to anything I say." Mrs. Brooks approached, holding a bag of treats. "Daisy doesn't need you to boss her around. She needs you to work with her. Try being patient. Let her set the pace for a while." Skeptical but desperate, Jake followed her advice. He stopped pulling on the leash and instead walked slowly, letting Daisy explore. When she turned to look at him, he knelt down and offered her a treat. "Good girl," he said softly, surprised at the way her tail wagged in response. By the end of the walk, Daisy was trotting happily beside him, her trust in him growing with each step. Jake smiled to himself, realizing for the first time that patience and kindness could accomplish more than force. Ryan, on the other hand, continued to spend most of his time with Max, the scrappy terrier who had initially been too afraid to let anyone near him. One rainy afternoon, Ryan sat outside Max's kennel, watching as the dog curled up in the corner, his eyes wary. "You don't trust anyone, do you?" Ryan said quietly. Max didn't move, but his ears twitched at the sound of Ryan's voice. Ryan sighed. "I get it. People suck sometimes." The next day, Ryan brought an old sweatshirt from home and placed it in Max's kennel. "Here," he said. "It smells like me. Maybe it'll help you get used to me being around." It was a small gesture, but it made a big difference. Within days, Max was cautiously approaching the kennel door when Ryan arrived. The first time Max let Ryan scratch behind his ears, Ryan couldn't help but grin. "See? I told you I wasn't so bad," Ryan said, his voice filled with quiet pride. Mia's transformation came in the form of empathy. Initially assigned to administrative tasks, she had been content to avoid direct interaction with the animals. But during an adoption event, she was paired with a shy, elderly beagle named Rusty. "He's not exactly the easiest dog to place," Mrs. Brooks explained, "but he deserves a home just as much as the puppies do." At first, Mia was nervous around Rusty. His slow movements and cloudy eyes made him seem fragile, and she worried about doing something wrong. But as she spent more time with him, she began to see his gentle spirit. When a young couple approached, interested in adopting a dog, Mia found herself advocating for Rusty. "He's older," she said, stroking his fur, "but he's really sweet. He loves being around people and just needs a quiet place to relax." The couple agreed to meet Rusty, and by the end of the day, he had found a new home. Mia watched them walk away, her heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment. One evening, Mrs. Brooks gathered the 3 teenagers in the shelter's break room. "I've seen a lot of people come through here over the years," she began, "and I can tell when someone's just going through the motions. But you 3, you've changed. You've put in the work and it shows." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We still screwed up, though. What we did. It was awful." Mrs. Brooks nodded. "It was. But owning up to it and doing better, that's what matters. Those dogs you hurt, they'll never forget what happened. But they'll also never forget the kindness you're showing now." Ryan glanced at Jake, then Mia. "Do you think we can fix it? Like, really fix it?" Mrs. Brooks smiled gently. "You can't undo the past, but you can make the future better. And that's a good place to start." As the weeks went on, the teens continued their work at the shelter. Their bond with the animals deepened, and so did their sense of accountability. They began organizing fundraisers for the shelter, volunteering their free time, and even speaking to younger students about the importance of compassion and responsibility. Jake found a new sense of purpose in training dogs like Daisy, while Ryan took pride in helping scared animals like Max find trust again. Mia became an advocate for overlooked pets, working tirelessly to help older animals find homes. One evening, Sarah received a text from Jake. "Hey, just wanted to say thanks for, making me face everything. I think I'm better for it." Sarah stared at the message for a long moment before replying, "I think we all are." Ethan couldn't have been prouder. The teen's transformation wasn't just a win for the shelter or the animals. It was a win for the community. It proved that even the darkest actions could lead to light if people were willing to change. The day the puppies were ready for adoption was bittersweet for Ethan and Sarah. The shelter had found homes for each pup, thanks to the help of the teens and their growing dedication to the cause. Chance, however, wasn't going anywhere. He had become a permanent member of the Carter family. On the morning of the adoption event, Ethan found Sarah sitting in the backyard with Luna and the pups. Chance was sprawled across her lap, snoring softly, while the others played in the grass. "You okay?" Ethan asked, sitting beside her on the worn wooden bench. Sarah nodded but didn't look up. "I'm gonna miss them," she said quietly. "I know," Ethan replied, placing a hand on her shoulder. "But they're going to good homes, and we'll still have Luna and Chance." "That's not nothing," Sarah sighed, brushing a tear away before it could fall. "It's just, I didn't think I'd get attached. But they feel like family." Ethan gave her a small smile. "That's because you've put your heart into this, Sarah. And that's a good thing. It means you care." At the adoption event, families gathered around the puppies, cooing over their playful antics. Ethan stood near the shelter's booth, chatting with Mrs. Brooks and watching as each pup was introduced to its new family. Sarah stayed close to Luna and Chance, her protective instincts on full display. She only relaxed when the last pup was adopted, a small brown and white one she had called Peanut. A young boy with bright eyes and an infectious grin cradled Peanut in his arms, promising to take care of him forever. "You did good, kid," Ethan said as they packed up to leave. Sarah smiled faintly. "It's harder than I thought it would be." "Good things usually are," Ethan replied. Back at home, the house felt quieter without the chaos of multiple puppies underfoot. But it wasn't empty. Luna had found her place as the heart of their family, her gentle presence a reminder of everything they had worked through. And Chance, true to his name, represented the fresh start they had all found together. One evening, as Ethan and Sarah sat on the porch with Luna and Chance at their feet, Sarah broke the silence. "Do you think Mom would have liked all of this?" she asked, her voice soft. Ethan took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the fading light of the horizon. "She would have loved it. Your mom had the biggest heart. She always believed in giving second chances, whether to people, animals, or anything else." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. I think she'd be proud of us." "She would be," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Of both of us." For the first time in years, Sarah leaned her head against her father's shoulder, the weight of past pain slowly lifting. "I think I'm proud of us, too." Meanwhile, Jake, Ryan, and Mia continued to work at the shelter long after their community service hours were complete. Their bond with the animals, and with each other, had deepened, and they had become passionate advocates for change. Jake started volunteering at adoption events, helping dogs like Daisy find homes. Ryan worked with fearful animals, using the patience he had learned with Max. And Mia became a dedicated fundraiser, using her social media savvy to draw attention to the shelter's needs. One afternoon, the three of them approached Ethan and Sarah outside the shelter. "Mr. Carter," Jake began awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just wanted to say thanks for, everything. If you hadn't made us face what we did, I don't think we'd be where we are now." Ethan nodded, his expression warm. "I'm glad you're using this as a chance to grow. That's all I ever wanted." Sarah smiled at Jake. "You guys really have changed." Jake shrugged, his grin sheepish. "Yeah, well, we had a good example. The seasons changed, and life moved forward. The Carters found their new normal, one filled with laughter, love, and the occasional chaos that came with a mischievous puppy like Chance. Sarah grew more confident and compassionate, her bond with her father stronger than ever. Ethan, too, found healing in the small moments, watching Luna nap in the sun, tossing a ball for Chance, and seeing Sarah rediscover her joy. And though the memory of Emily remained, it was no longer a source of pain but a guiding light, a reminder of the love that had built their family and the strength that carried them through. As they sat together one evening, watching the stars come out, Sarah turned to Ethan. "Do you think we're okay now?" she asked. Ethan smiled, his heart full. "I think we're better than okay. I think we're finally where we're meant to be." Luna wagged her tail, and Chance barked happily, as if in agreement. Together, they sat under the endless sky, ready to embrace whatever came next. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and if you made it this far, comment "I made it this far" and share your thoughts about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video popping up on the end screen. It's super exciting.